I love this painting by Van Gogh. Isn't it amazing?
Mhm.
Yeah, it is. There's some good images in these slides, so I'm excited.
Oh, aren't they compelling?
Okay,
And they speak for themselves, actually.
All right, go ahead, Samantha.
it's okay. All right, thank you so much for joining us this morning, everyone. We'll wait just a couple more minutes just to see joins, but thank you for coming in this morning. We're so excited to have you. All right, well, welcome to this morning's virtual tour. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you're joining us over Facebook, welcome to you as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please stay muted throughout the lecture and save all of your questions for the end. If you do happen to have a question, please feel free to use the chat function down at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us via Zoom in order to type in your question, and we'd be happy to address those at the end. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, you can do the same in the comment section under the video in order to add your question, and we'll be monitoring that and we can answer those questions as well. Finally, this lecture is being recorded and is being, as we said, streamed on Facebook Live. So if you would like to go back and watch any of our previous lectures or see any of the other lectures put on by the Timken, please feel free to check out our social media, our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and you can see all of those lectures there. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our docent today, Karen. She's going to be presenting on Post-Impressionism and Nabis painting in France, and we're so excited to have her. So I'll go ahead and turn this over to her.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Samantha is a wonderful intern. She's a graduate student in art history, and she's just been a great addition to our Timken group. So we'll begin with the topic of Post-Impressionism and Nabis painting in France. What we're really looking at time period is about the 1880s. Really what we're going to be studying today is the advent of modernism. Now, it isn't to say that the Post-Impressionists, who we're going to really focus on, Seurat, Cezanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh, the four horsemen of the Post-Impressionism, they were modernists and they bridge the 19th to the 20th century. However, we did have some other artists working in what we would consider a modernist vein. Probably the first image that really captures the modernist tradition would be 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 by Manet. And that was a very provocative, controversial painting that really heralded this idea of moving forward from traditional aspects of painting. The other thing I wanted to mention is Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet, which is done in 1872. Again, that is heralding really the Impressionist movement. And by looking at the title, Post-Impressionism, you know that Impressionism is the catalyst for this movement of Post-Impressionism. Now, let's just take a look at, we will talk about this more specifically later in the talk when we go into the work of Van Gogh, probably the most iconic French 19th century artist. Everybody seems to know Van Gogh. His stories were so captivating. His artwork was stellar. His palette is remarkable. And so we will be talking about that a little bit later. But here we have this beautiful Japanese style cherry blossoms. And we'll talk about exactly what happened with this and why he painted it and what it really means. Now, we're going to look at the work of Paul Cezanne. Paul Cezanne was an innovator, and many people believe he really was the catalyst to modernism. So let's talk just briefly before we talk about his work. I just want to mention a little bit about where Impressionism comes from and then how Post-Impressionism begins. Impressionism moves away from realism. Realism was a movement in, and we're talking about France, in the mid-19th century. The artists Millet and Courbet wanted to move away from mythological themes and romantic themes and really talk about what's happening in France and look at the sociological issues of France, the factories, from industrialization, the railroads that were developing. We also have the beginning of colonization. French colonization was ubiquitous. They went into East Africa, North Africa, parts of Southeast Asia. And so France is really a changing country, still very agrarian, but yet changing. And so realism in the mid-19th century was kind of the pervasive style. Now the Impressionists began to say, well, we want to capture a bit of a lighter side of life, maybe leisure activities, maybe things like the ballet and horse racing and sitting by a beautiful ocean. And so they started to experiment more with light and color and sort of choppy brush strokes. People like Monet painted several landscapes over and over to study light. But that is different for the Post-Impressionists. The Post-Impressionists wanted to move forward and bring their own artistic view of art to the masses. And so they wanted to sort of experiment and push the limits of what Impressionism was doing. And one of the greatest people to do that is Paul Cezanne. Now, Cezanne, of course, grew up in Aix-en-Provence, and his father was a banker. He was very blessed to have a private income. He really didn't have to worry about selling his work. And in the beginning, he worked with the French Impressionist Pissarro. And Pissarro was one of the older Impressionists, and he influenced Monet, for example. So Cezanne studied with Pissarro, and he decided, I'm more interested in a different kind of exploration, and that is the forms of geometry. So Cezanne felt that you could push art by the use of rectangles and rhombi and circles. And so he saw nature and art in terms of geometric forms. He once said, nature is best depicted in terms of three-dimensional geometric forms. So he was very unique in that area. He worked in Paris for a while, and eventually he moved back to the south of France. And you will see some of his work from the next image. So let me just talk about this self-portrait. Some people, art historians, would say that this self-portrait by Paul Cezanne, sort of the father of Post-Impressionism, is very objective. What I mean by that is most portraits done by artists have a very subjective sensibility, but this is not. How do we know that? Well, let's look at the eyes. These are unfinished. The eyes of the artist, the metaphor for the artist, they're unfinished. Also, we have the mirroring of forms. Look here in the indentation of the beard and the cheek, and how it is mirrored here with the thumb in the palette. The palette, where he mixes his paints, has a tendency to block us really from the artist. It kind of sets up a bit of a barrier. And then, of course, we have an anonymous painting. We see the canvas, but we don't see what he's painting. Again, a kind of an anonymous aspect to the painting. And then we look at the muted colors, very monochromatic, muted colors, sort of browns and greens. So it's a very muted palette. So what we have really is a very distant portrait of a painter. And again, we see all these geometric forms. Even his body is blocky and geometric in sensibility. So, as I say, he worked with some of the Impressionists. He actually showed with some of the Impressionists, but he, as an intellectual, decided to sort of push the limits of what Impressionism was doing and begin to focus on geometry. Now, later on, you see, this is 1887. 20 years later, Picasso and Braque, two of the greatest artists of the 20th century, early 20th century, and then into the 20th century, they copied a lot of what Cezanne was doing, and they created a movement called Cubism. Analytical and synthetic Cubism was based on fracturing the picture plane and creating three-dimensionality and looking at geometry. Now, Mount Sainte-Victoire is in the south of France, and it is made of limestone. And so I mentioned that Cezanne came from a wealthy family. His family had a summer home here, and he often spent time living in this region and painting over and over again this beautiful limestone mountain. And sometimes he included the aqueducts here, the Roman aqueducts, and the countryside, and these beautiful expanses of greenery, farm country. Remember, even though France is industrialized and removed for the Franco-Prussian War that drained a lot of its coffers in the 1870s, it is moving into a pretty stable economy. But farming is really still the central economic feature to France. But you can see in this beautiful palette of greens and pinks that he does capture this amazing mountain in a very geometric form, not quite as extreme as we will see in the next images, but you do see this geometric triangle and the very squares and rectangles of the buildings. Now the palette is softer. It's a little bit softer than we saw in the previous image. And again, you can see his connection to Impressionism. If I'm not mistaken, currently the Museum of Modern Art has something like 200 of his drawings on exhibition. So he came back to this place. It had a lot of meaning to France because it was like a work of Titian. It reminds us a bit of Peter Paul Rubens. So he did hearken to those Baroque painters and those Renaissance painters. Now he creates this amazing, beautifully sculpted gathering of naked women, and we see that the pyramidal form is captured not only in the bodies, and we can see that even in the limbs, the elongated limbs, but we also have this beautiful tree form. And then if you recall some of the images of Monet, for example, who he knew and worked with, you can see some of that beautiful cerulean blue that Monet used. And look at the dappling of the paint. This is quite different than what the Impressionists use. These are a little bit more elongated brushstrokes. We have these anonymous figures. Now, this topic really comes from a poem by Baudelaire. And so he is hearkening to literary references to create this painting. And we are going to talk about, as we go farther on, we're going to talk about how the movement of symbolism, we're going to talk about that in just a second, really affected these post-impressionist artists. All right, so this is the large bathers, and he did a series of bathers. They're in different museums, but this was the largest and the most compelling. Again, one point I wanted to make is you always see this sort of ubiquitous landscape with the church and the buildings of the town, but we are so focused on the movement of this painting, we are just sort of captured by the mid range of this image. Now, let's look at this. Not only was Cezanne a remarkable landscape painter, many people think he was the greatest landscape painter of the 19th century. He was also a very proficient and talented still life painter. I will mention that he was not a great figurative painter. Not that he didn't do a good job, but he didn't really like to do a lot of figurative images. He was a very shy man. And even though he did show with the Impressionists, eventually he moved away from them. And as I said, intellectually wanted to explore new ideas, but part of it too, he was very, very shy. And he really liked to keep to himself. So painting a lot of figurative images besides his wife, a few others, he mostly concentrated on the landscape and the still life. One thing that's kind of an interesting point about him is he was a draft dodger. And so he had to kind of escape to the countryside with his girlfriend at the time because he didn't want to serve in the military like some of them had to do, Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. So for a little time, he was kind of on the lam, but fortunately his private income and his connections helped him. Now, let's look at this very interesting still life. I'm going to say something a little quirky in that the parts of these disconnected tabletops, they are on totally different picture planes, work to connect the tabletop. It's just kind of a remarkable idea. So if we look again, we have, pardon me. If we look again at the tabletop, we can see in this diagonal form, these do really not match up, but it works, it serves a purpose. Now we have the very discordant tilting of the wine bottle, and we see these peaches and perhaps pears sort of tilting forward as if they're going to roll off the table. And then, of course, we have this cornucopia style basket in the same manner. It doesn't even seem like it's grounded to the still life. So you can see that his studying of the geometric form, he's fracturing of the picture plane, his tilting, and different ways of depicting this natural form is very far-reaching, very advanced, very modern. And you can see why Picasso loved his work. All right, now we're going to move on to one of the most romantic of the Post-Impressionist painters, and that is Paul Gauguin. He has a very interesting history, and so we'll begin by talking a little bit about him. He was actually born in Paris, if I'm not mistaken, but when he was a young man, his father was a journalist, and he was given a position in Peru. So the family set sail for this exotic place, Peru. However, en route, his father died. And so they stayed a short time in Peru and then moved back to France. Gauguin studied in a French Catholic middle school and middle and high school. And so he was very steeped in Catholic religious study. And this will come up in many of his paintings because most of his paintings have a Christian theme. Of course, this is the crucifixion. But before we talk specifically about this, because this was done in Breton, he moved from Paris to Breton in the south, in the countryside, and then eventually to Tahiti and the Marquesan Islands. And that's kind of why he became so romantic in people studying him, because he moved to the South Seas and adopted a very kind of revolutionary style of life. Now, he was married, lived in Paris, and he was married to a Danish woman. He had 5 children. He was a stockbroker, and then he abandoned her and the children with somewhat tragic consequences and left, as I said, for Breton, and then eventually the South Seas. So we'll talk a little bit about his style. He sought exotic environments. He actually thought he had Inca blood. He was a prodigious carouser, womanizer. He was kind of not such a nice guy, but he did have a remarkable capacity to create this modernist art. What is most interesting, perhaps, about his work is the palette. His color was exquisite. He also was very interested, as many of the art, particularly Van Gogh, Seurat, and Gauguin, and Van Gogh, excuse me, in Japanese woodblocks. Because remember I told you that the French were colonizing areas of the Far East, and Japanese woodblocks were flooding the French market. And so they were just very interested in the flat two-dimensional forms of these Japanese woodblock prints. You can actually see the use of a woodblock print in the outline of this yellow Christ. But look at these exquisite colors, these autumn colors, and this remarkable reds and yellow, and these interesting forms here that gather around the foreground. They are in 19th century Breton costumes, even though we're dealing with an ancient crucifixion. The Christ has a very sad and languid form. The women pray, they hover around him. You can see the countryside and a man climbing over a low wall. So it's the color, it's the flat two-dimensional form, it's the exotic nature of the painting. One other thing is he was very influential, Gauguin, to the modernists, Matisse and Picasso, particularly Matisse's color range and Picasso's extension into Cubism. The other thing I wanted to point out is he was very involved with the symbolist movement. And the symbolist movement was happening in Russia, Belgium, and France. And it was linked to artists exploring their own spiritual, metaphysical ways of thinking. And it was connected to literature, writers like Baudelaire and others. So it was very much a literary art movement that Gauguin really championed. So let's look at another painting. La Orana Maria really is Hail Mary. Okay, so again, he combines a Polynesian backdrop, a Christian theme, which is actually the Annunciation, Gabriel, who is styled as a Polynesian figure here with wings, how Gabriel hearkens to the Virgin Mary to say that you will have the Christ child. And here we have a young child hovering over her, rather large, much larger than we tend to think of in terms of a Madonna child. She's dressed in what is called a paraya, which is like a wrapped dress. And even here we have semi-naked forms who were heralding the Virgin Mary. So that puts a little bit of an exotic, erotic twist on the image. And then we have, of course, the fruit, the papaya, and the bananas in this exquisite color form. Very flat, very two-dimensional. However, you do have some two-dimensional in the forms of the vegetation and the floral elements with this beautiful purple pathway. But two-dimensional, and when you think about how this is kind of aligned, it does not stand out from the foreground. Many of these artists were looking at what complementary colors would do in a painting. And what I mean by the complementary colors, so we have this idea of orange and blue when put together are just resonate. It's so intellectual, the orange, the vibrancy of the orange, the coolness of the blue. So many of these artists, particularly when we get to the work of Seurat, we'll see that color composition is very important to this artist. So Gauguin paints this as a Christian theme in a very Polynesian setting. Now, there's a story that many people talk about, and that is that Paul Gauguin went to live with the great Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. And at the time that this was done, they were working together in Arles, where Van Gogh had moved in 1888. And he had lived in Paris, he had lived in the Netherlands and also Belgium, Vincent van Gogh, and then eventually he went to the countryside of France. Well, he became friends with Gauguin in Paris. Actually, they knew each other because, again, Van Gogh knew the Impressionists and worked with some of them, but again, moved into his own way of painting. And so they kept contact, and Van Gogh invited Gauguin, come work with me, let's work together. But at the time that they began to work together in Arles, Van Gogh was not doing very well. And so the relationship faltered after a few weeks. But I do want to talk a little bit about how it began. So Van Gogh invited, here we have Van Gogh, the painter of sunflowers. Here he invites Gauguin to stay with him in the little yellow house that he built in Arles. And in preparation for the visit, Van Gogh painted 3 or 4 beautiful sunflower paintings and put them in the guest room for Gauguin. And Gauguin was captivated. He was just mesmerized by these beautiful sunflowers. And he always called Van Gogh the painter of sunflowers. And we know because that famous painting of sunflowers, there were more than one, it's one of the most iconic paintings that Van Gogh ever did. When you think about flowers, and I always talk about this, and particularly when you look at the Dutch Baroque and Flemish Baroque, flowers have a meaning, a metaphorical symbolism. And sunflowers, for example, always represented things like hope and life and youth and longevity. And so, and they're so bright and lovely. And so Van Gogh was always really captivated by them. So Gauguin considers him the sunflower painter. And this was a time of hope for the two of the artists to work together. Now, this painting was not done as Gauguin was looking at Van Gogh, like, oh, I'm going to do a portrait of you. This is kind of a symbolic, metaphorical remembrance of his friend at one time, Van Gogh, this great painter. And if you look at it, it's very unusual, very modern, and this pushing apart the two portions of the painting. We have the figure at a tilt, and then we have his canvas here, and then this beautiful kind of almost fluid capturing of the sunflower, and then this blue and orange, just quite beautiful, and the palette here. So if you look at his face, however, Van Gogh was starting to spiral into, again, this form of madness that he suffered from. Off and on, he had terrible problems, maybe even epileptic seizures. He was not a stable man. He was a brilliant man, a brilliant artist, one of the most important artists of the millennium, excuse me. But he did suffer quite tragically. They only stayed together a few weeks. Shortly after this was done, Vincent van Gogh pulled a razor on Gauguin, and Gauguin goes, I'm going to leave. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the life of Van Gogh, we'll talk about it. Please see the movie. I have to think about it. It's. I'll have to think about. I'm sorry. Eternity's Gate by Julian Schnabel. It was done about 4 years ago, and it does depict the last 2 years of Van Gogh's life. Now, let's go back to Gauguin for just a minute. This is his masterpiece. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? So let's talk about the meaning of this magnificent horizontal painting. As I mentioned, when Paul Gauguin was a young man, a student from about the age of, I believe, like 10 to like 14, he did study catechism. He went to a Catholic school, and the priest who was his main instructor always posed these intellectual, challenging questions like, where do we come from? What is our origins? Who are we? What are we? What will happen in our life? So Gauguin experiments with that theme, that intellectual, spiritual idea. So when he captures this painting, again, a very religious painting, he wants you to read it from right to left. And what he shows here are these young, beautiful women, and I hate to use the term, but well, let's say indigenous women, to Polynesian women who were various states of undress. Unfortunately, Gauguin often painted his young mistress, who was 13, pretty awful. When he painted this, some horrible things were happening in his life. He abandoned his family, as I told you, in Paris, and his favorite child, who was a teenager, died, probably of diphtheria. He was so distraught that he decided to paint this to try to explore what happened and what his life was about. And then he took arsenic, and he assumed he would die. Well, he didn't die. He actually survived it. And he continued on, died later of syphilis and alcoholism. But anyway, he was painting this to sort of try to figure out his life. Now, you can't really see it here, but there's an infant lying here, and then we have these young girls. And this represents the cycle of life, and these are the young girls who represent our early life. And then as we go through the painting, these beautiful symbolist forms of flat, you can also see, again, this sort of Japanese influence, and also North African influences, sort of these arabesques. And so with this exquisite palette of blues and yellows and orange. And so this section kind of represents the growth of us as we move into more middle age and the prime of our life. And then we have, of course, the natural world. And before I talk about this section, I want to show you this white bird. Most people think of white birds, dove, and peace, but no. In this case, he represents the white bird as a futility of language, how language can sometimes escape us and is futile and difficult. So this is kind of a negative representation. But here we also have again, we have the title in French up here, but we have an old woman. And what the old woman represents is she accepts the later part of her life, and she understands her place in terms of her age and life. And we also see this blue form. And this blue form represents sort of the afterlife in a rather exotic manner. And you see he's now moved away from Christian iconography. So it does have a reference to Christian beliefs, but it also, he shows a more exotic reference to our afterlife. So this is the quintessential work by Gauguin. Now, I'm going to move on to a really different artist, and that is Georges Seurat. Seurat was known to be the father of pointillism. And pointillism is a style of painting that actually allows for our own retinas to put the painting together. This is the Sunday afternoon on the Grand Yacht. And this is actually a park at the gates of Paris. And he paints a magnificent, huge monumental work. And this is actually in the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm sure if you get a chance, you will maybe have seen it. And this idea of pointillism comes from a couple explorations. One is his interest in mathematics. The other is in his interest in the color theories of a man named Paul Chevreul, who was a chemist, a scientist, an inventor. He lived to the age of 107, which is just remarkable. And he was experimenting with color wheels and the ideas of color. And so Seurat looked at those studies and became captivated. And he looked at complementary colors, and he saw that complementary colors, red and green, orange and blue, violet and purple, when they were combined, they almost kind of cancel each other out. But when they were side by side, they had a profound effect on the retina. So he was experimenting with that. Seurat, like Cezanne, came from a wealthy family. And he was very blessed, again, that he had a private income and he could pursue his art. Sad to say, this brilliant artist died at the age of 31. So he never got to fulfill his brilliance as an artist, his part of modernism. His work was taken up by Paul-Signac, who we will look at in just a little while, but let's focus here on Seurat. So Seurat is interested in mathematics, he's interested in color theories. He develops a style of pointillism that, what we know now, it looks like pixels, right? We think about the evolution of computers and this sort of art form. Now, he studied Piero della Francesca, who was an early Renaissance painter, and he looked at this work and he loved I'm very sorry, he loved the profile forms of these, I'm sorry, my computer's, he loved the profile. So this looks like some of the work of Piero della Francesca from the 15th century, and it also harkens to some type of Egyptian hieroglyphics and iconography. So we have this very form of portrait in turn to the side, but we have the central character, this young girl and her mother with a parasol looking directly at the viewer. Rather interesting. They kind of confront us. The other thing is this is along outside near the Seine, and as I said, this park, this public park, was outside of the gates of Paris. And what you have is people doing leisurely activities. You also have some really interesting things, a little girl playing like hopscotch. We have a woman with a monkey on a leash, a little lap dog here. We have all kinds of interesting things. A man kind of referencing a more upper class form, you know, the top hat and the cane. We have people in more formal dress with this sort of fun bustle in the back as she holds the monkey. But we also have some kind of subliminal references to some kind of different kinds of things. Now we have people fishing here. And I'm sorry to say, I'm going to make a rather kind of inappropriate reference. And that is, it is said that metaphorically, Seurat was suggesting that prostitution actually did happen in this park, like some really beautiful sailing and walking the children, but also this park was known for prostitution. And so this represents this woman fishing, perhaps might make a reference to that. So you can also look at this combining of color. This is a very labor-intensive painting, very labor-intensive. We're going to move on and look at a work done a little bit later, and this is the circus. Now, when we talked about Impressionism, I said that Impressionism often dealt with the more delightful, realistic aspects of French society. One man, Gogh, another one, Lautrec, often painted the various activities of French people. They love the circus and the ballet and the opera. And so Seurat takes on that interest, but his painting is so much different. It is swirling in action. We have the acrobats in midair. We have the clowns, who are singing out, the clowns here. We have the ringleader watching as this woman just is tilted at this almost unbelievable angle as the horse canters around this round or semicircle. We can see a form of pointillism here, the dots, these sort of dots, and then we also see the division of society and the division of the canvas. The canvas is divided as we have this line here of the ring and the horses in motion, but we also see a cross-section of French society. So we have the upper classes, more upper class people would be in the front rows with the best seats, of course, and then we go up to the nosebleeds. So, the upper class and maybe more bourgeois, and then we go up to the French, the working class, and they're looking in, and then we can see these wonderful musicians up here at the top, and again, the whip as he points to get the horse going. So this is harkens from what would be painted maybe 15 years prior in the Impressionists. But what's different? It's a more modern approach. It's using this mathematical art style with pointillism and the arrangement. We see motion. We have a completely different palette. We see a lot of use of primary colors. We have blue, red, and blue, red, and yellow with this very heightened use of white. And so we can see that he is considered a modernist because he pushes the limit of just recording, an interior activity with all kinds of unique sensibilities. I see that I'm going to run out of time if I don't move on. So I think probably my favorite work by Seurat is The Bathers at Asnières-sur-Seine. Asnières-sur-Seine was on the rim of the Seine, and it was an area, it was a working class district, and it was an area where a lot of young working men would come to relax, maybe on a Sunday, or maybe even take a little break and have a few minutes to themselves. And again, as I mentioned, this is very much after the work of Pierre della Francesca. He studied him. Look at these exquisite colors. Again, these workers in profile. It is a study of leisure time and relaxation, but you also see, again, what has happened in France about 80 years prior, and that is industrialization, the smokestacks, the rims of buildings lining the river. Of course, we also have these leisurely activities of boating and these beautiful trees. And this would not exactly be considered pointillism. It is sort of experimenting with it, but it's not so specific as you see in, let's just go back for just a moment, in this. This is, even though it was done at the same time, this is really concentrating on that use of pointillism, that dots, that hyper stippling of the, I'm sorry, I lost my thing for just a second. We'll move back to our original, again, I apologize, moving forward. And so, but the colors, these exquisite colors, this calm and relaxed expression of late 19th century activity. Now, I'm so terribly sorry that this is glitching out. Pardon me, my computer's not been doing very well. So sadly, I mentioned that Seurat died young. He died at 31, and the same time period, just very shortly after he died, his own son died. He was married. He hid his family from his parents who supported him, but it was very tragic. So both died. He died very young. The person who took up the mantle of his work was Paul Signac. And Signac worked with Seurat in Paris for a time. They worked together, and he too was interested in this idea of pointillism. Now, this painting doesn't really exactly use pointillism. It is more impressionistic, because you remember all these post-impressionist artists were either worked or exhibited with the Impressionists, particularly Monet and Pissarro, and so they were very well of the work of the Impressionists. And so, like some of the, like Monet, for example, Signac captured a French landscape, and it is very impressionistic. You see sort of this gestural style of painting. We see the shadows. Remember, the Impressionists were really captivated by light and the study of light, but not so much the Post-Impressionists. You don't see this heightened interest in light, but they did go out in the landscape. Oftentimes, they actually began to use photography. Even Seurat, when he was painting, used photography, which had been really moving along for at least 50 years. Daguerreotypes were decades in use, so they could use photography. But this is more of what we would consider a more impressionistic landscape. Now, we have so much more to cover, so I do want to move on, but I just want to show you that later, in the very early part of the 20th century, Signac was so troubled by the death of his mentor, Seurat, that he took a voyage around the Mediterranean, and he stayed for a while in Saint-Tropez, and he really captures this overwhelming landscape of Saint-Tropez, this beautiful Mediterranean seaport, and he encloses it all, and you see the workers and the beautiful sunlight, and the pointillism, that this is a very use of pointillism, and we see the beautiful buildings, the sky, the abstract quality, and you can see how the evolution of Fauvism begins a few years later. So I don't want to leave out our wonderful Van Gogh, so we're going to move on. Vincent van Gogh, probably, as I say, the most iconic artist of the 19th century. Everybody knows Van Gogh. They know about his troubled life. You see his work in everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts, but he was such an important artist. So let's talk about a little bit about this. If you look at this painting, you might remember Rembrandt's 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲. 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲 is really the model for this very religious painting. At the time, Vincent van Gogh, who was of Dutch extraction, his father was a preacher. He also took the mantle of pastor, and he moved to Belgium, and which is, adjacent to Holland, and he became a lay pastor for the working poor in the coal mining regions of Belgium. And here we have an evening meal, and you can very much get that use of light, that chiaroscuro that Rembrandt so brilliantly captured. And here these poor people, some of them almost very kind of glum, they sit around and they eat their evening meal, and it's very monochromatic, and it's just a very condensed space, and the light, this chiaroscuro, the light that falls on their face coming from this single lamp, it shows poverty and hardship. And this is what Vincent van Gogh was observing. However, and of course his palette is so monochromatic, so unlike what we will see. But you can also see the influence, again, of that Japanese woodblocks, because it's very outlined, it's very flat, it's more two-dimensional. Now, unfortunately, Van Gogh was asked to leave his post as a lay preacher, and he began to work with his brother, Theo, and he moved first, he worked for Theo as an art dealer. He worked in Paris, he worked in Holland, he worked in Belgium. And eventually he settled in Paris for a while, and he actually worked with some of the Impressionist painters. His work, however, was so influential that later people like Picasso and Matisse were very interested in his work. But he couldn't work with the Impressionists. His work was too unique. He was moving into a more modernistic way of thinking, and he decides to go to the countryside of Arles. And he lives in a little room in this cafe, the night cafe. It's the Café de Gare, which means the cafe of the station. It was a very poor, kind of rundown little building. He rented a room in this building, and then eventually had his little yellow house in Arles. Now, let's look at this, the night cafe. Wow, this is a study of isolation. It's a study of futility of alcohol. And it just shows this cafe at night. Now, many artists do not do a lot of night painting, but Van Gogh loved to paint the night. I often have talked about how night painting, if you look at an artist's their work, you will see maybe 10% would be, if you're a landscape painter, would be night, and maybe the 80, 90% would be daytime. But Van Gogh loved the night. So what does he show? As I told you, it shows isolation. And what we have is these people ring the cafe, and they are either drunk or so impoverished that they can't even move away from the table to go to another place to sleep. They actually sleep here. They're all men except from this one woman. And you see this kind of hopelessness. Look at the acerbic colors, the use of green and red, these complementary colors, so stark. They're very acerbic. It's claustrophobic. We have a pool table in the center, unused, but we always have this sort of ubiquitous bouquet of flowers. And this is the image that brings a little bit of hope to the painting. We also have this doorway and the chair. Now, Van Gogh, after Gauguin left his company, he painted 2 chairs. And chairs, these are reminiscent of the chairs he did paint, because he thought that chairs were the metaphor for the human form. And so chairs often factor very seriously in his work. But we have the owner of the cafe, we have this acerbic colors and strong palette, and then we have the ubiquitous clock, the ephemeral nature of time. And then, of course, the alcoholic image, the bottles and the glasses. Now, again, for time, I'm going to move on. This is such a contrast, such a juxtaposition of stark and acerbic sadness to beauty and joy. So Van Gogh painted this upon the birth of his wonderful brother Theo's child, Vincent, who he was named after. Sad little story that Vincent van Gogh was actually named after his dead brother, who was born before him, died very, very young. And then the parents named their second child Vincent, which is a little bit creepy. But his brother Theo was the most important supporter of his creativity, financially and otherwise. And so when Theo had a son, he named him Vincent. And Vincent van Gogh wanted to paint a very uplifting image for this young man, his baby, he was the godfather and the uncle too. So he paints these beautiful Japanese style cherry blossoms, and they're against this exquisite blue sky. They're very hopeful, they're light filled, they're just beautiful. And the only thing is, we don't really know, are these cut branches in a vase, because he often liked to do that, or were they natural in nature? I have a tendency to think that they were in nature because of this branch here. This does not connect to this, would be a bouquet. Another sad story about this painting is, even though he was hopeful and he wanted this kind of rebirth with this child coming into his life, he was spiraling into madness. He went to Saint-Tropez to try to convalesce. He knew he wasn't doing very well. He did make it to Paris. He was able to present this painting to Theo and the little baby, but he died shortly after. Now, as is pointed out in the movie Eternity's Gate, some people do not think that Van Gogh actually committed suicide. Some people think that he was out doing plein air painting and he was being harassed by some local youth, and he started to overreact, and one of them shot him into the abdomen, and he never really wanted to say that happened. So he died quietly 2 days later. Other people would say, no, that's not true. He did commit suicide. His mental state was filled with anguish at the time. Now, just really quickly, I want to point out that he did, this nephew, who was named after Vincent, in 1973, when he was 82 years old, developed the Van Gogh Museum. So he became very important to preserving his uncle's legacy, first in a foundation and then in the fantastic Van Gogh Museum. Now, I see my time is, so we have to look at Starry Night. Again, one of the most important paintings he ever did. This is such an important painting. It really talks about where our place is in the cosmos, how we all look to our life and wonder, where do we fit in? What is our place? It's kind of what Gauguin was grappling with. But here we have the swirling night sky and the moon and the stars as they look over the town with the church steeple. Remember, he was steeped in Christianity. The poplar trees, the swirling brushstroke. Again, his life was sort of spiraling into madness. And we see this very expressionistic painting. Now, you have to understand that as Cezanne influenced the Cubist painters, Baroque, and Picasso, Van Gogh influenced the study of Expressionism, German Expressionism, for example. They were very influenced by Van Gogh. And so what he also had looked at, remember, he was Dutch, and he's very influenced by the Netherlandish painter Peter Bruegel, 16th century, the great master of Northern Renaissance painting. And of course, as you know, our Timken collection has a masterful painting by Bruegel, Parable of the Sower. And it's done in an aerial perspective, just as this is done. So this remarkable painting, Starry Night, talks about our place in the cosmos. He uses a swirling expressionistic brushstroke, and again, showing that influence of Japanese woodblock painting, his growth as a painter and artist. And it is sad though, because we do know within a year he would not be alive. Now, we're going to move on, if I can advance my, I'm terribly sorry, I'm having a little bit of a glitch with my computer at this time. This has never happened, so I'll try again to tap it. So we are going to move just for a few minutes to the work of a couple of artists who move away from Post-Impressionism and go into what we call the Nabis painters. And probably the artist who's most representative of that is Pierre, Bonnard, Vuillard, and Matisse. Now, it could be argued that Matisse really was a great influence of the Nabis painters. They were the segue between Fauvism, which occurs in the early part of the 20th century, that was heralded by Matisse, and Post-Impressionism. So Nabis means, in Hebrew, the prophet. And these artists, these Nabis artists, Bonnard being one of them, wanted to look for a more spiritual connection, literary connection, to the world of art. And again, they, like Gauguin, looked at the symbolists, artists and painters, and they wanted to create a new style of work that was very personal, spiritual, and almost cult-like. They actually used to have a little chant when they would get together about art and line and design. Now, Bonnard really uses that Japanese woodblock print style. He even uses a stamp that the Japanese would use. He shows military cadets, and he almost is making fun of them. Why? Look at these huge packs. They seem outsized. They seem childlike. He served in the military, Bonnard. He hated it, and he kind of made fun of it. Bonnard also worked as a lawyer for quite a while, and he was also interested in capturing interiors, what people live like, their homes, their gardens. So I'm going to move on because, again, our timing, and I so apologize. I'm just really having some problems with my computer, but we'll just bear with me and we'll try again. All right. So Bonnard also went to the countryside, and he paints his wife, who is sort of leaning over this open space, an open window, and he matches the inside with the outside. These artists were very, as I said, interested in interiors. They were interested in North African carpets and textiles. They often, many of the Nabis painters not only did painting, but they did textile and ceramics and designed set design. And so you kind of get that idea here. This almost looks like, an interior exterior combination. We have the cats as they sit on the chair. We have one sort of draped. We have a beautiful little table with a flower arrangement. We have fruits or treats on the table. And we have his wife in this bathed in this exquisite light. Now, because we only have a couple minutes, I just have to move to one of the greatest artists of the 20th century who was part of this movement for a short time. And we're just going to move on, sorry. And we're going to look at Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse was a genius of the late 19th century to 1954. He was considered the greatest colorist of that time period. His palette was exquisite. He had a great rivalry with Picasso. Often they were challenging each other, but Matisse had a different idea of art. He felt that art should be a restful opportunity for us, like an armchair, a quiet armchair, where we would just be able to access our feelings and not try to deal with, I'm terribly sorry, I'm having a glitch in my computer, and we'll just have to see if I can do one more image before we take questions. So, and this is the most important painting done by Matisse, and this is Harmony in Red. This is his masterpiece. And again, I'm terribly sorry, I'm having a real glitch with my computer. This, just 1 minute on this painting. This is actually in the Hermitage Museum in Russia, in Leningrad. I actually was lucky to see this painting. And what he shows is his interest in North African motifs. Matisse did go to North Africa for a short time, and he was captivated by the textiles. You see these arabesques here. He was also interested in Japanese woodblocks and more exotic locales. This is considered his masterpiece, and we see a garden window. His studio looked out to a garden, and we also have most likely his wife, and she is attempting to serve some fruits, but what we see is no focal point. Everything is swirling around us in this remarkable color. So this is really the genius of Matisse. Matisse goes on in about 1907 to form the Fauvist movement. And however, he was the segue from Post-Impressionism, from Nabis to the Fauvist painters. Now, if I can just try to hit on this painting one more time, and we will, here we go. So that you can see this in all its exquisite composition. And again, this heightened use of color. At one time, this painting was actually Harmony in Blue, but he didn't like the blue outcome, so he paints it. It was collected by the great Russian businessman Shurkin, who amassed a great deal of post-impressionist painting and impressionist painting. And so when you go to Russia, if you go to the Hermitage or the Pushkin, it is remarkable that you will see so many French post-impressionist, impressionist artists, because they had a lot of money and they were smart enough to pursue collecting some of these French painters. Now I will do one more painting while we wait for Samantha. And just one more painting by Matisse, if I can again access it, because I'm having a little click. Well, there's Samantha, and I guess we will stop here because I'm not having a lot of luck with my advancing my images. So
it's totally fine. Thank you so much, Karen. What a wonderful presentation. These artists are so interesting. And so thank you so much for doing this for us. A little virtual round of applause. At this point, we'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. As I said earlier, you can use the chat function down at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on Facebook Live, you can also use the comment section there. Kelly saying thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly. I see some applause. Perfect. Karen, if you have do you have a favorite out of these artists that you've covered?
Oh, that is such a good question. If I could have one painting, it would be this one.
Yeah.
I think even though he's moving out of that category of those four artists that we mentioned, Van Gogh and et cetera, and he was a sort of the conduit again into modernism, I just find this to be one of the most remarkable paintings I've ever seen. And it really took when I saw it at the Hermitage, it literally took my breath away. It is very large and just vibrant. And I love the idea that Matisse painted these exquisite images, and they're not political. Not that political art isn't important, because I do like political art, but it's just such this harmonious, exquisite capturing of form and line. I just find it remarkable. That's such a good question. What about you, Samantha? If you could.
Goodness. Van Gogh has to be my favorite. I know he's everyone's favorite, but I love him so much. There is a question from Facebook that I'll pass on to you.
Sure.
Our user says, as I observed, there is a vibrant red hue very much prevalent in Bonnard's paintings. How intentional was that? Similarly, Van Gogh focuses more on the shades of yellow. Are these purely the painter's whim?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. I believe it is the painter's whim. I really do. Now, unlike this painting, however, this is almost a study in color for color's sake, color and line. And again, Matisse, as I mentioned, he was very interested in North African textiles and ceramics. So he's really incorporating those studies. But no, I can't really say that is a specific to something conceptual. In general, all of these artists were experimenting with color and brushstroke. And of course, we know that Seurat more with the application of paint, but Gauguin, Van Gogh, etc., were more just looking at complementary colors and color theories. Well, Seurat was, of course, too. So no, I can't say. I think I would say more personal.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you. Cass has a similar question. But why the blue in the Matisse self-portrait and discussion of complex textiles and Bonnard? I would say probably similar, do you think, Karen, as far as choosing lots of blue in his self-portrait?
Yes, and I want to mention one other thing. It's really important to know that blue throughout art history, when you look at the Renaissance, blue has always been a spiritual color. Blue represents spirituality, the heavens, and also cool and intellectual ideas. So not so much intellectual, I would say more yellow would be, or orange would be. Orange and blue together are such an important combination, because blue is spirituality and orange is intellectualism. So sometimes they would combine those colors to create that kind of sort of juxtaposition, but blue is spiritual. So that's that. If I could answer that, I think blue is hearkening to the idea of spirituality in art. Because remember, when the Virgin Mary, you're always seeing her garments would be blue and red because of the spiritual nature of it.
Right. Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for all the questions, everyone.
Yes.
I think that is all the questions we have. We have lots of thank yous. Cheryl is saying this is a great segue to a trip to the south of France. So have fun on that trip.
Oh, wow. Fabulous.
Yeah. So otherwise, though, thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, this talk and all of the other talks done through the Timken have been recorded and are posted on our social media. So please feel free to check that out. If you would like to see information for upcoming tours, that is also on the Timken website. We have another tour led by Karen tomorrow. So if you would like to join us for that, we'd love to have you. Otherwise, thank you again so much, Karen, for such a fantastic talk. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Oops.